We'll begin tonight by asking the question, why? Why choose a career in natural foods? The first part of the answer is relevance. There's a national conversation going on right now about how food and health, personal health, community health, and planetary health are related. And the kind of health we're talking about is not just limited to the absence of physical disease. It's more like ecology, in that we're engaged in discovering and understanding the relationships between food and physical health, food and mental health and well-being, food and environmental health, and food and the health of our country's economy and infrastructure. In many ways, natural foods is at the center of this conversation. What I mean when I say natural foods is food that is minimally processed. It doesn't contain artificial sweeteners, colors, or flavorings, and it was not produced using chemicals, antibiotics, or hormones. That's close to what most people think of when they hear the term organic, but organic is a regulated term with some very specific definitions. So for tonight, we'll just stick with natural foods, and we'll agree that we mean food that is as close to its real original state as possible. So for example, whole oats would be a natural food, but Kellogg's super processed crackling oat bran with its 3 kinds of sweeteners and artificial flavors would not. Now, who are the people in this conversation? Who are the stakeholders? I won't name all of them, but a few of them are the food manufacturing and distribution industry, the government and public services institutions, the healthcare industry, the media, producers and publishers, chefs, food retailers, and plain old citizens and consumers. What we are discussing is topics like, what is a healthy diet? How should we eat? How do people learn about food and cooking? How should our food be grown and produced? Is healthy food available to everyone? And what is the economic impact if it isn't? There are only 3 websites featured on this page, and we could have used hundreds. It's a crowded conversation. But I want to take a look at these 3 because I think they will help us understand who some of the stakeholders are and how they're framing and presenting the issues. In the middle, we have an example of natural foods in a governmental, institutional, economic context, a policy context. It's called Let's Move. This program's main focus is on childhood obesity, and its initiatives include parent and child education about diet and exercise, improving access to healthy foods in schools and communities, and increasing physical activity as a part of lifestyle. You might remember recent news about the food pyramid being replaced by My Plate. That is part of this program's effort to educate people about eating a nutritionally balanced diet. In her speech to kick off Let's Move, First Lady Michelle Obama said, "The physical and emotional health of an entire generation and the economic health and security of our nation is at stake." She said the economic health and security of our nation is at stake. Why? Because so many children are overweight and have diseases that in many cases could be avoided or alleviated through changes in their diet and lifestyle. So we're not only looking at a drain on healthcare resources and a huge challenge to our educational system, right? Because how can kids learn if they're not eating well and if so many of them are sidelined by complications of disease? We're looking at a drain on our future, productivity, participation as taxpayers, not to mention the lack of fit and healthy people for law enforcement, firefighters, military, other public service, and emergency care jobs. So if we were to ask First Lady Michelle Obama if a career in natural foods is relevant, she would no doubt give us an enthusiastic yes. Now the image to the left is Jamie Oliver's Food Revolution, which follows in a similar vein of addressing childhood obesity and healthy eating. But Jamie's focus is on school lunches and teaching kids about food and cooking. His show looks into what kids are fed and whether they receive any education about food and healthy diet while they're at school. Do children learn where food comes from? Do they learn what to eat? Do they learn how to cook? I chose Jamie Oliver in part because he's an example of someone who started out as a chef and restaurateur, and early in his career he was also a spokesman for a supermarket chain. but he gradually became a natural foods and healthy eating educator and activist. Now, because he's a chef, Jamie's focus is on cooking and the enjoyment of foods as much as it is about teaching people to make healthier choices. Let's face it, Jamie says, healthy foods got to taste good for people to make the change. Ever the practical man, he is also quick to point out that cooking will always be cheaper than eating out. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of reality TV, and in my opinion, sometimes Jamie's show tries a little too hard to create those teary-eyed epiphanies and breakthroughs that reality TV traffics in, but there is no doubt that he is sincere and making a big difference. And there's also no doubt that other chefs will follow in his chef as activist and educator footsteps. So finally, to the right, we have the New York Times, whose food, health, and nutrition sections have undergone a remarkable transformation over the last 5 years. Their Recipes for Health section in particular is becoming a vegetarian and vegan cooking encyclopedia. The section's main columnist is Martha Rose Schulman. Here's a quote from a recent interview. "I learned to cook when I was 17 and loved cooking right away. I was already an enthusiastic cook and explored recipes and cookbooks from an early age. Then I got into vegetarian cooking at a time when there wasn't much that was good out there. I was living in Austin, Texas, and decided to teach vegetarian cooking classes. I didn't want to do a restaurant, but I wanted to cook for people, so I started a private supper club in my home. After I'd been doing this a couple of years, I wrote my first cookbook. It came out in 1979, and it was called The Vegetarian Feast." So here we are, over 30 years later. This self-taught self-starter has the New York Times as her platform, and she educates readers about the healthy benefits of and how to cook with natural foods. I chose her for this relevance section for two reasons. First, it's an example of a major news outlet being engaged in this conversation. And second, Schulman's story is a good lead-in to our next section. But before we move on, I'd like to check in with you first and see if there are any questions or comments about this first section. Remember to use the chat feature and make sure that it's sending to presenter. Sounds like everybody's good. Okay, we'll move on. So I want to go back to Ms. Schulman for a second, because I think we all have some things in common. Remember that she was self-taught, and she showed an interest in cooking at an early age. Instead of taking a more conventional route to become a chef, she did her own thing, because her options for being the kind of chef she wanted to be were so limited. She went on to write cookbooks and forge her own path to her current job developing and publishing recipes in a popular featured section of the New York Times. What I believe we all have in common with her is that we all want our careers to reflect our personal values and interests. We all want our careers to have meaning. And in our search for meaningful careers, we've discovered that making a difference is part of what makes us tick. We like to cook, we like to feed people, and we want to make a positive, supportive contribution to other people's experiences of food, cooking, and health.